Do you know what kind of past grievances and entanglements exist between the purifying demonic lotus flame and the purifying demonic lotus saint? Why is it said that if viewed from the perspective of the purifying demonic lotus flame, it actually did nothing wrong? To put it bluntly, the purifying demonic lotus flame is also a pitiful existence. In the latest storyline, the famous scene of the Seven Saints verses, the demonic lotus flame finally appears. However, what no one expected was that all of this had actually been deliberately orchestrated by the purifying demonic lotus flame itself. First, one key point must be clarified. The intelligence of the purifying demonic lotus flame was, in fact, bestowed upon it by the purifying demonic lotus saint. In the original story, even the saint himself admitted that when he first encountered the purifying demonic lotus flame, it was as pure as an infant. It was he who granted it intelligence, giving it human-like thoughts. Simply put, the purifying demonic lotus saint was both its creator and the closest being in its life. Logically, such kindness should have been remembered forever. But the root of the conflict lies in the saint's overwhelming desire to protect. The purifying demonic lotus flame ranked third on the heavenly flame. Rankings possess terrifying destructive power. The saint feared that if it were allowed to roam freely, it would bring catastrophic disaster upon the world. Thus, when his lifespan was nearing its end, he chose to seal it within the demonic lotus flame space. Here lies the crucial point: the saint never intended to harm it. The original story mentions that he initially wanted to erase its memory and return it to its pure state. But he could not bring himself to do so. Instead, he chose to seal it, hoping that the confinement would gradually dispel its violence and killing intent. What he never expected, however, was that this seal would last for thousands of years. Thousands of years of isolation and imprisonment anyone would break under such conditions. The purifying demonic lotus flame, which had gained intelligence and its own thoughts, was confined by the very person it trusted most, trapped in a narrow space enduring endless loneliness day after day, year after year. This is why when it finally broke free, it became so violent. It was not its original nature. It was the result of thousands of years of suppression, where hope was slowly boiled into hatred. In the original story, every time the purifying demonic lotus flame mentions the saint, it is filled with resentment. It roars, "Without me, could you have achieved such accomplishments? I helped you so much, yet in the end you sealed me. You deserve to be devoured by backlash and die." These words may sound arrogant, but beneath them lies deep grievance. It had accompanied the purifying demonic lotus saint for thousands of years. Even if not credited for merit, it had certainly endured hardship. Yet in the end, all it received was endless imprisonment. Some may argue that the saint acted for the sake of all living beings. That is true. But from the perspective of the purifying demonic lotus flame, what did it do wrong? It never actively harmed anyone. It only sought freedom, yet was betrayed by the one it trusted most. Later, when it backlashed against the saint, it may appear ungrateful, but in reality, it was more like an explosion after long-term suppression. Any intelligent being imprisoned for thousands of years would likely make the same choice. Looking again at the events within the demonic lotus flame space, facing the siege of Seven Daosheng, the purifying demonic lotus flame first pretended to be sealed by the heavenly Luo demon sealing array, causing internal chaos among the crowd as they frantically fought over the flame's origin. In the end, it even took control of the saint's heaven refining ancient array, intending to refine everyone in the space into flame slaves. Just as it was about to break free, a remnant image of the purifying demonic lotus saint suddenly awakened within Xiaoyan's mind, the very light cluster. That had appeared when Xiaoyan gathered the fragments of the map. So don't say Xiaoyan's map was useless. After the saint's remnant soul appeared, the first thing it tried to do was to strip away the purifying demonic lotus flame's memory and intelligence, claiming it would return it to its original purity. But from the flame's perspective, this was no different from killing it. It desperately begged, "Without memory, without intelligence, I would have no consciousness. How is that any different from killing me?" Here we see the core conflict between the two. The purifying demonic lotus saint, standing from the perspective of righteousness, believed he was saving both the flame and the world. The purifying demonic lotus flame, from its own perspective, only wanted freedom and self-awareness, refusing to be controlled even by its creator. In the end, both perished together. The saint died believing he was right. The flame died filled with resentment. At its core, this is a tragedy without absolute right or wrong. The saint's intentions were good, but but he ignored the flame's desire for freedom as a sentient being. The flame's hatred was real, but its violence was forged by thousands of years of imprisonment. Many people criticize the purifying demonic lotus flame for being ungrateful, but few consider that from the moment it gained intelligence, it was never truly free. It accompanied the saint through his growth only to receive endless loneliness in return. It struggled desperately to escape, only to face the fate of having its intelligence stripped away. Its brutality was merely its way of protecting itself and resisting injustice. In the original story, the saint ultimately said, "I do not hate you. Even though you once backlashed against me in the end, I hold no resentment. I have no disciples, no children from beginning to end. You were the one closest to me." These words seem gentle, yet they carry a hint of selfishness. He imposed his sense of righteousness upon the flame, never asking whether it was willing to accept such protection. So, in the end, the purifying demonic lotus flame truly did nothing wrong. It was merely a being granted intelligence, yet deprived of freedom. It only ever wanted one thing, not power, not dominance, not destruction, but the simple right to exist on its own terms, to think for itself, to choose for itself, to live without invisible chains binding its will. Yet, for daring to reach for that freedom, it was condemned, misunderstood, and branded as violent, as ungrateful, as something that had to be controlled. But was it truly wrong? From the outside, its rage looks terrifying, a heavenly flame that burns with uncontrollable fury, a force that devours, resists, and lashes out at the world. But beneath that blazing inferno is a being that once trusted, once followed, once believed. A being that was given consciousness only to be denied the very freedom that consciousness demands. Imagine awakening to awareness only to find your fate already decided by someone else. Imagine trusting the one who gave you life only to be sealed away by that same hand, not for what you have done, but for what you might become. Thousands of years, not days, not centuries. Thousands of years of silence, of isolation, of endless suffocating stillness. No voice to answer you. No world to explore, no choice to make, just time stretching on until hope itself begins to rot. What begins as confusion becomes pain. What begins as pain becomes resentment. And what begins as resentment inevitably becomes fury. So, when the purifying demonic lotus flame finally broke free, was that truly evil? Or was it simply the inevitable cry of something that had been denied its right to live? People call it ungrateful because it turned against its creator. But they forget something crucial. Gratitude cannot survive without freedom. Kindness when forced becomes a cage. Protection when imposed becomes oppression. To the purifying demonic lotus saint, it was an act of salvation, a necessary sacrifice for the sake of the world. But to the flame, it was betrayal, a betrayal wrapped in righteousness, a prison built from good intentions. And that is where this tragedy truly takes shape. Because neither of them were truly wrong. One chose the world. The other chose itself. One believed in responsibility. The other believed in freedom. And between those two beliefs, there was never a path where both could coexist. In the end, they destroyed each other, not out of hatred alone, but because neither could understand the other's truth. The saint died, convinced he had done what was right. The flame endured, consumed by the scars of what had been done to it. And history chose to remember only one side. It called the flame violent. It called it ungrateful. It called it dangerous. But it never asked, what if all it ever wanted was simply not to be controlled? What if its so-called brutality was nothing more than resistance? What if its rage was the final desperate proof that it was alive? In the end, this was never a story of good versus evil. It was a story of choice, of perspective, of the unbearable cost of forcing one will upon another. And among all those entangled in this fate, the one who burned the brightest, the one who screamed the loudest, the one who was feared the most, was also the one who had never once been free. The purifying demonic lotus flame was not a monster born of destruction. It was a soul forged in confinement, a will that refused to break, and a tragedy that no one ever truly tried to understand. And perhaps that is why, among all the legends of power and glory, its story remains the most heartbreaking of all. If you enjoy my way of explaining and storytelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really motivates me to keep creating.